Dobrý večer všetkým. Hello, nice to have you all here with us. Thank you for the silence as well. I will start in English this time, not to complicate things. Welcome at the third lecture in the 10th year of the series Reflections on Architecture. I'm very happy that this year we are introducing the architecture scene of United Kingdom. And I'm even more happy that today we have the pleasure to welcome our dear guest architect, Adam Caruso. Please, can you move a little bit, like, not to be so small, you know? Adam Caruso, yeah, give him an applause. I don't want to use or misuse the time, but I just want to underline that Adam Caruso, with his colleague Peter St. John's, they established their studio in 1990, if I'm correct, and already from them they started to do their very contextual and intellectual work in the field of architecture, doing small designs, but also right now huge complexes and very important public renovations, etc., etc. But Adam will say more about it. I just want to perhaps just remind you of a recent publication which was last year, 2024. There is this huge monothematic issue on your office on this Japanese architecture A+U magazine, so perhaps you can go through it. And this is already for the second time that they focus on your office, so try to imagine how important they are. Located in London and in Zurich right now, doing works all around Europe, including Belgium, Netherlands, UK, Germany, Switzerland, Slovakia, unfortunately not yet, but perhaps it will come, so I would very much appreciate that. But yeah, Adam, thank you so much, really, because actually, to be a little bit like personal, Adam was already here in Slovakia, but only in a virtual form. He gave a lecture in frame of the Days of Architecture in Design during the COVID time, and now he is here in person, so we are very, very happy all about this. So yeah, please, the floor is yours, and the micro as well.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Henrietta, and yeah, thanks for inviting me. I've already seen a very small, but it was perfect, but very interesting part of Bratislava yesterday with Pavel. That was a great visit of the museum, and then some amazing buildings today, including the radio station, which really was a building unlike any I've ever seen, in a good way. So this lecture, I'm going to show our work, but it's actually a very thematic lecture, and I hope you can follow it, and I'll try and talk quite slowly. And I'm going to read a lot of it because it's quite complex. So it's called What Is It Worth? And I'm really trying to articulate what I think architects can do in 2025. Because what we've been doing for the last 30 or 40 years, looking back from today, one can see that, of course, we've done things that are good architecture and things that are productive for society, but we've also been part of an incredibly destructive economy of extraction. And I almost feel embarrassed that it's only in the last 10 years or so that I really consciously, that I acknowledge that. Anyway, so what is it worth? Oops. I'll use this keyboard to be more precise. Okay. So, Homo sapiens have existed for at least 200,000 years. The caves of Chauvet were created over a period of at least 10,000 years, between 35,000 and 25,000 BC, during which time a lot of dramatic events occurred, and we have no way of knowing about most of them, because these caves and others like them, which are actually found on every continent of the world other than Antarctica, caves like this painted at the same time, these are part of prehistory, right? So we can't read about what these people were thinking of. Okay, now to go much more to the present. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan, which still is the founding text of modern political theory. So what Hobbes said was that life in the original state of nature was in no sense innocent, but it was rather solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And that this state of kind of chaos and war was only kept in check by the political mechanisms that started to develop kind of in, I mean, the times of Hobbes, it was still the time of absolute monarchies, but where monarchies started to somehow enfranchise the rich people of society. So Hobbes was saying that without politics, we are savages. And then in 1754, Rousseau wrote the Discourse on the Origin and the Foundation of Inequality Amongst Mankind. And what Rousseau said was the opposite of what Hobbes said. He said that early humans were hunter-gatherers, they were egalitarian, and that they lost their innocence with the coming of agrarian societies and the coming of politics. So he believed in the innocent and the benevolent primitive who was corrupted by politics. The reason I'm mentioning these two things is that neither of those positions are the truth. They were both theories. Yeah, they were written by Hobbes and by Rousseau, and yet in 2025, if you think about it, the way in which we organize our lives within societies are still, in a very serious way, still informed by those ideas. I mean, I don't know if you know, but Rousseau's text was actually written because there was a competition in France at that time in order to conceive of this dynamic between the origins and modern man. And so it was completely speculative, and yet, obviously, it was very influential. Okay, then in 2021, a book called The Dawn of Everything was written by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And I read this book a couple of years ago, and I must say it rather changed the way I think about things. So it describes new and much more complex stories about our 200,000 years of history, giving a context for the theories of Rousseau and of Hobbes, which they, I would say, prove are only ideas and not objective truths. In The Dawn of Everything, prehistory is described as a much more complex and diverse world than we've ever imagined before. This work, which is in part anthropology and in another part archaeology, is talking about our common past, but it's also very much intended as a call to activism today. Because actually David Graeber, for those of you who know, was an important part of the Occupy movement. He's an anarchist, really. He's dead, unfortunately. He died just after this book was finished. So they're writing a book which is, on one hand, historical, which really, for me, but I'm using it with my students this semester, and some of them, it's really like blowing their minds because it offers so many positive ways of thinking about the situation that we're in. So it's a work of history and anthropology and archaeology, but it's also really about us today. And you could say that the most important idea in the book is that today we have agency in deciding and forming the societies that we want to live in. That we're not slaves to, say, neoliberal capitalism or to communism or to any particular form of society. And what's amazing in the book is that they show how the development from 35,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago was not just an inexorable line between hunter-gatherers and sedentary societies, but societies went back and forth, and people chose to withdraw from agrarian societies because they didn't like, for instance, the hierarchical structures that came along with agrarian societies. I really recommend the book, and you only need to read a few. You don't need to read all of it at once, you know. So, if architects are going to be serious about responding to the environmental turn, we need to acknowledge the central role we have in the consumption of resources. We need to stop building new structures and learn again to see the value of what already exists and communicate these values in a compelling way to our clients and to politicians. This act of describing is, I believe, the most important task of contemporary architecture. This does not mean the end of architecture. It's the opposite. It means that we have to find new forms of architecture, like we found many times in the past, whenever there's a kind of serious political turn that we have to acknowledge somehow. Before the 20th century and before modernism, the management and the adaptation of existing buildings was a central task of architects. I had a professor who said that Michelangelo only ever did renovation projects. The Porta Pia was a new building, but other than that, he only renovated existing buildings. This idea of an architecture of interpretation and adaptation, of finding the values in what are already there, can take many forms. So this is a detail that I particularly enjoy of Brunelleschi's the chapel that he added to Santa Croce, so the Pazzi Chapel. And it's actually a new structure added to an existing church. But what we can see in this picture, which shows a very awkward corner resolution of the classical languages, Brunelleschi, knowing and really trying to engage with the classical language of architecture, which at the time was something quite fresh and was being rediscovered, and having to adapt it to 15th century Florence. So although it's a new building, he's having to engage both with the existing church that he's adding to, but also to this kind of cultural world of classicism, which was only starting to kind of permeate early Renaissance Florence. But there's more contemporary versions of this kind of engaging with and inventing from existing situations. So this is a very typical scene from near where I live now, which is a village in Switzerland. And farmers, if you think about how farmers deal with their buildings, they don't do drawings, they rarely work with architects, but they have a very deep knowledge of what their buildings need to do, and they also have a deep knowledge about how to use available material. And so in this stack of wood, you can see that this particular farmer for some reason, has an incredibly long tarp, maybe from a truck or something, and with the tarp and with large stones is able to make a protection for the wood so that it dries out and can be used over the next many years as firewood. So the incredible invention, but also an incredible purposefulness and I think also very powerful formal piece of work. And then finally, this is one of a number of photographs that the artists Fischli and Weiss took in the early 90s, which were a kind of very careful illustration, but also, I think, celebration of the suburbs of Zurich. Suburbs that are famously boring, filled with bad architecture, but I think in the photographs that Fischli and Weiss were making, they showed how actually they were incredibly rich places for inhabitation, where the rather dumb and background quality of this, not amazing modernist architecture made a setting where landscapes could unfold and where you can easily imagine people living their lives. So there are many, many examples of how we can really take seriously what we find in front of us and make architecture out of that. Okay. So now I have 4 themes which I'm going to introduce in equally exhaustive detail, and then I'm going to show some projects which I will try to describe in the context of those themes. So the first is the idea of plan and unplan. Architects, at least since the end of the 19th century, have been trained to solve problems, which in turn means being in control. There is a tendency for architects to be control freaks, and I'm certainly not innocent of that tendency. The degree of control required of good architecture today is becoming unrealistic, because there's so many factors that actually lie outside the core practice of architecture, which really I find year by year become more and more present in the project and are actually things that we have no ability to control. Things like the way a project is financed, let's say, which have a tangible effect on the form and the construction of the project. So today I find that the contemporary architect is asked to resolve situations that are full of irreconcilable conflicts. Increasingly, I find myself in situations where I don't want to solve these problems, since often they address issues like the asset value of the project that we're working on, and the perceptions of the market, let's say, to an apartment plan. Matters that are utterly removed from any idea of making projects that are socially and materially responsible. So how can architects start to work, with the same idealism and the same desire to make good work, but in a way that requires less control? In 1952, John Cage composed 4 minutes and 33 seconds, a short piece of music that does not require a concert hall, and certainly doesn't require a concert hall that's acoustically isolated from its environment, or that has an ideal reverberation time of 2.4 seconds. The performance of this piece of music is not adversely affected by people coughing in the audience, or by the audience getting bored and shifting in their seats, although they might get bored during the performance of this piece. But in John Cage's view, the shifting in the seats, the coughing, the sound of traffic coming in to the room, all of those things would become part of 4 minutes and 33 seconds. This piece of music isn't my favorite piece of music, but its composition's capacity to accommodate the contingencies of time and place in its performance is revolutionary. You just think about it. So Cage is saying that the environment in which the piece is played becomes part of the piece of music. And of course, this is a very extreme statement of that position, but he composed many other pieces of music which also allow their environment to come in and become part of the piece of music. In non-Western music, this idea of music and real life happening at the same time at the same place is much more common. So, for instance, when ragas are played in India, the performances can be 4 or 6 or even hours long or even longer. And clearly, if one is attending a performance that's 6 hours long, the expectation is not that you don't move or make any sound or that you don't eat and drink during the performance. And that doesn't mean that the audience is any less respectful or engaged with the music. The other difference between non-Western forms of music, but also music like post-bebop jazz, so something like, say, Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, is that these pieces of music don't have a finite and a kind of centered compositional structure. They rather have structures which are cyclical, which are pulsing, which are ongoing, which is another kind of structural quality which allows them, I think, to adapt and to be affected by the situation within which they are performed. So if architects would accept the inevitability of losing control, if projects became more cyclical and ongoing rather than formally finite, this would allow for unexpected complexities. It would allow us to have the ability to accommodate contingencies arising during the period of a project and consequently allow for a more profound engagement with the physical, the social, and the temporal qualities of each project. I think there's always been architecture that works this way, whether intentionally or not. This is another, I like this plan because it almost looks the same as the John Cage scar, because it's so empty and so dumb. So this is the plan of Louis Sullivan's Carson Perry Scott building, which was a department store built in the middle of Chicago at the end of the 19th century. And you can see it's a container for retail space. That's it. The architecture of the interior is absent. And all of the architecture of Sullivan's building was concentrated along the perimeter, along its facade. Actually, only two facades, because the other facades were one to a lane and one to another building. And so this is a building that, on the one hand, is very specific in that it's in the middle of Chicago, 19th century Chicago. Its facades are really quite extraordinary, and they still today have a really powerful effect and positive contribution to the city. But on the other hand, because of the absolute generic abstraction of the plan, which is really just a very, very efficient steel grid, it's also a building which is completely open programmatically, which you can read in many, many different ways. And I think if we look closely, many buildings in the city have these qualities. It's like the opposite of what we expect from a monumental or representational architecture, which is actually always the majority of building. So I'm going to show two projects by us, which I think could be read in that context. So the first one is a project from 2016, and it's a project that was undertaken in this really giant steel factory in Lille in the north of France. And it was, so the factory was converted into a whole new quarter of the city, and it's finished now. And our project, which is for a lycée where they teach gastronomy and hotel trades, was the most civic building within this new quarter. So it was a competition, and it was a competition that we won because our scheme was by far the easiest. We did the least to change the existing structure and spatial morphology of the building. Our scheme retained the most of the existing, these incredible sheds under which for 80 years steel, mostly for railway construction, were built. And where, so that's the site, and that's where the lycée is. I mean, now a lot of the sheds have been demolished and replaced with housing buildings and office buildings and stuff, but some have been retained. And our project was really a project where we retained as many of the sheds as we could, and then we added new buildings which were almost exactly like the sheds. So really it's a bit like both of my examples, you could say, is that we saw what was there, we kind of looked at it as carefully as we didn't even need to look very carefully. We tried to really engage with the qualities that this place had, which was about these sheds, was about repetition, was about an empty shed next to a full shed. And we made a project according to that logic. A consequence of that, and it was something that we were very interested in, I think it was another reason that we won the competition, was that the image of the factory was retained in our project much more than in the other projects. And for the politicians, and Martine Aubry was at that time the mayor, a very powerful national figure in France, for them that was important because Les Fives, which is the name of this area of Lille, was a really working class part of the city, still occupied by working class people who voted for the Socialist Party, of which Martine Aubry was the head, and so that this association that they used to have with the factory, they could have once again. So this practical strategy also has a kind of symbolic content. And I think that's often the case, that if you do one thing that's really very, very precisely connected to what's there and what you propose, that other things can come out of those decisions. I'm not going to go through the plan. It's an incredibly complicated kind of building. It's for 1,800 students from the age of 16 to early 20s. I think it has 22 kitchens. It has 4 restaurants. It has hotels going from 1-star to 5-star, like on each floor, test rooms. It's a crazy kind of program, a bit like a student project, but it's a real project. And there's, I think, 20 lycées like this in France to teach people about cooking and hotels. So we built some new buildings in this project, and they're the ones that kind of make up the space between the factory and the surrounding city. And we made these buildings so that they're a little bit like the houses which surround the site, but they're also a bit like the sheds inside the site. So they kind of are rhyming with what's there, rhyming with the image of what's there. And then you go into the site and you see that these volumes of program then define public or semi-public spaces. So spaces like this, which is between a student's residence and a residence for the professors, which is a new garden. But then spaces between the buildings that are like the spaces of a factory, like yards, but then that start to have new uses because it's a public building. So this is actually one of the main entries into the site. And then this passage, which is that is the main covered space of the whole quarter. And here the school is on this side, and the other side is now fully occupied by other program. The colors, okay, so we had to depollute the existing structure, so all the colors were removed. But then we repainted all the steelwork exactly the same colors as they were before. But not the original colors, but the colors that were 50 years old. So we bought it at the time, a color scanner, and we were able to scan all of the surfaces of the paint before we had to remove it to get rid of the lead. And then we reapplied these colors to existing steel, but also to new elements like these curtain walls to the classrooms. And then you enter the school proper, and it's based around another garden, which is in one of these existing sheds. So I guess, what I'm saying is that there's obviously a lot of planning goes into the organization of this building, but in another way, there is no plan. The plan is just the existing site, and we almost don't change the logic of that. So that's the element of it having no plan. Okay, a very different building. This is from 2020, and it's a very standard Zurich office building. It's the green one, and it's a building that's in Zurich West, which is an ex-industrial area which still has some parts of industry, but our most prominent neighbor is this Hardbrücke, this road viaduct which goes through Zurich from north to south, no, from east to west rather, which was restored, so it's going to stay there for the next 40 years. So our idea in this project was, it was really like trying to make a 21st century version of a Chicago office building, I guess. A building that only had the stuff that you needed in order for it to function as an office building. So I don't need to, it's here. It's there. Oh, you can, there. And this is the viaduct. And the building, it's just like a pure structure. So you see the viaduct and then the building next to it. And then in the other direction. And the volume on top has the technical installation, and it's like a beam which then holds the ends in order to make these big cantilevers on the ends. And that's really the only public gesture of this building. Otherwise, it's like a pure structure which is next to the viaduct and which provides office space with a very efficient plan. So that's it, and you kind of see it from, there's quite a few places where you see it. And it's like, how do you make a building whose neighbor is a viaduct? And then at the end elevations are these balconies which have quite beautiful assortment of planting, which works all 12 months of the year and which is irrigated, so it's always alive. And that was, it's the beginning of starting to plant more trees and more green in that area, which is a big initiative in Zurich. So anyway, so those are two projects where really the idea of the plan is as dumb and as kind of inevitable as it possibly can be. Okay, so my next theme is bound and unbound. So in 1963, Edouard Manet painted Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Manet was an artist obsessed with both the cultural and the material histories of painting. And in this painting, in common with all of his most ambitious work, you have residues of the previous 400 years of painting history. He desperately wanted to be acknowledged as a great painter. He submitted his paintings to the Salon every year, and every year they were refused because he had the misfortune of also being, or of especially being, an incredibly engaged and great modern artist. And I think as a result of his sensitivity to his times, his work in a really deep way engages with the social and temporal conditions of his time. So this painting, while its composition comes from Renaissance examples and from examples from antiquity, more than anything else, what it does is it shows how, for instance, the convention of perspective is not a truth, but it's a cultural invention. And with this painting, he shows how the perspective is clearly breaking. And the reason he's doing that, I think, is to show how this bucolic scene of this odd group of the naked woman and the dressed men having a picnic, but also this kind of weird Grace in the background, who we don't know, is she giant or small? It's hard to tell. All of these destabilizing things are really about the way in which in the Paris of Haussmann, one suddenly became aware of the different classes because suddenly they were inhabiting the same streets. And so things like social inequality and the tensions that came from that, and the tensions that this first flush of capitalism was producing in society, all of those things are embodied in this painting. And you could say that's why the paintings were never accepted to the Salon, because they were challenging the kind of ancien régime values of the Salon. Yeah, that's enough about Manet. I mean, Manet is an incredible artist, and I think what's really, for me, special about his work is how modern he is, but he's not a modernist. He's still using the conventions of historical painting in an incredibly vital way. A more contemporary artist, this is The Day is Done by Mike Kelly from 2005. And Mike Kelly brings together themes that normally remain apart in cultural production, as well as in society. So Kelly's use of popular culture not only comes out of his working class origins, but it's a strategy to allow his work to more effectively reflect themes and conditions from contemporary life. It's a way of making art which was very successful and very much part of the art world, nonetheless engage with things that were happening not in the art world, that were happening in the real world. He combines tropes of high culture, the things that he learned in art school, like art films and abstract painting, with objects, images, and stories from popular culture. In a series that was done before The Day is Done, he made paintings and sculptures out of stuffed toys, children's stuffed toys. And they were very popular, but they were also, all of the critiques of the time said that these works with children's toys were referring to child abuse, and specifically to his abuse as a child. None of which was true. It never occurred to him that they were about child abuse, and he was not abused as a child. But when he read these critiques, he thought, well, they're communicating something powerful to some people, and so he said, yeah, they could be about that, and then he started to make work that was more explicitly about this thing, suppressed memory syndrome, which at that time was a very big discourse, especially in North America. So it's really interesting that in his work, which I don't think is about being accessible, I don't think he was interested in his work being, consumed by everybody, but that the way in which his work is received then is folded back into the work that he produces subsequently. So there's a kind of feedback loop between his production, the response to the work, and then the work that he goes on to make. And it was a kind of loop that embodied the whole of his practice. So you could say and it's very, very powerful, and I think it's something that makes his work very communicative and very powerful. So contemporary artists, they don't have a choice but to acknowledge the evident complexities of the world that they're working in. But they can remain slightly removed from that world because they're protected by the insulation afforded by art galleries and museums. They don't have to literally make work in the real world. Architects don't have that luxury. We have to make buildings that are in the real world. They become part of the real world, which has many exciting things about it. But since modernism, architecture has, in a very strong way, sought to tidy up the social, economic, and material complexities within which it's produced. I think there's been a real impetus that somehow, especially with modernist and neo-modernist architecture, that with very simple forms and organizational ideas, that we can somehow resolve a lot of complexities, which I don't think is true. And I guess I wonder if architects could also acknowledge the complexity that they're working in. Maybe we could find completely new possibilities and new freedoms and tolerances in our work in the same way that Manet and Kelly found in their work. So this is a project that we just finished last year. It's called Royal Belge, and it was a corporate headquarters built in the early 70s in a kind of very fancy area just on the edge of Brussels. So it was for a Belgian insurance company, and then it became AXA, the global insurance company, and it was designed by a kind of a well-known French architect who was obviously looking at American corporate models, things like Roche and Dinkerloo, etc. It has a Corten facade and kind of tinted orange glass, etc. So there was the developer who became our client bought the building thinking they could demolish it, and then it became a monument almost immediately after they bought it. So they were quite angry about that. And then they were forced by the city architect, who at the time was Christian Boret, who was a very important figure in Belgium and in Brussels, to do a short competition to find an architect. So not only did they have to keep the building, they were also forced to use decent architects. So we won the competition, which we did with Boevenbouw in Antwerp, and it was a very fast project, which at the beginning I had very low hopes for, because this developer seemed rather crude, but actually they were very clever, they had a very good contractor, and it really became quite an enjoyable project, especially because it happened so quickly. And it was a huge economic and social success when it was finished. It's a very busy place all the time, which is it's surprising. I mean, you can get there on the tram from the middle of Brussels. So the fact of this being a 70s corporate headquarters, it remains the image of the building. We don't do anything to challenge that. Yeah, so that's what it is. So it's like the perspective in Manet's painting. This is a corporate headquarters, and what you're looking at, a lot of it is new because it was there was a lot of technical problems with the facade, for instance. So we had to change all the glass and all of the gaskets, etc. But we didn't fight that because it would have been pointless. That's what it was. It's a big building. What our project is really about was about how you could change a single tenant building. So it was a building that was designed for, let's say, 1,200 insurance company employees into a multi-use building that had leisure facilities, co-working space for offices, a lot of eating places, a boutique hotel, non-co-working office space, a very complex program. And how we could do that, really making shifts in the building that largely are invisible. And then there's a few that are not. So this is the plan. And the circle on the bottom is a conference room, which in itself is part of the listing because it has these crazy cast bronze walls. But the circle in the middle is a completely new thing that we made. So it's a cut that goes right the way through the building, which connects, first of all, opens up this incredibly deep podium building, but also connects the entrance to the health club, to the hotel, for instance. And yet we make it in such a way that I think for most of the people who visit the building, they don't know that it wasn't there originally. So kind of playing with the conventions of the existing building, and sometimes doing it in an almost secret way, but in other times doing it in a way which actually requires enormous energy, but it kind of becomes secret after a while. It's the building, I don't need to go through it. That's the entrance. So everything you're seeing there was part of the image of the insurance headquarters. It's a crazy canopy. But this is one of the courtyards on the side, and everything that you see here on the ground floor is new, but you wouldn't know it. So all of the ground floor glazing was not there. This Corten steel balustrade with the stair is new. So there were certain things where we changed things because of the use inside. The stair was required because of fire regulations. So certain things we did in a way that was really like camouflage, you could say. And then this is the entrance where this kind of reception desk waiting area is new, and I guess you could tell it's new. But then if you look at the big opening on axis, that opening is new, but the marble to that side, I don't know your side, to the right-hand side is marble that actually was somewhere else and which we moved there. So we used all the material that we could, which we had to change things within the building. which obviously is the best place to reuse material, but we weren't only using it for sustainability reasons, we were also using it because this marble had a very powerful quality, and we wanted to keep the amount of marble in the podium part of the building, let's say. And here you can see the transition from the kind of marble, more monumental existing entrance, as I say, which we've moved around, and then a kind of rougher part where the new surfaces are just surface mounted, where we reuse some lights that we found, but we repeat the lights, so we make new ones, and then the co-working space through those big windows. And then this, at the center, this cut, where we have to extend the waffle slab that was existing, but which was not where we're making the cut. The cut we make where there were some previous core elements. So it was really a solid part of the plan which we make open. We also had to make 4 new columns, which look the same as the old columns, although they're not steel, they're concrete. And then we need to make the stair. So this is the stair. So the waffle slab that you're looking at, part of that is existing and part of it is new. The roof lighting through the waffle slab is completely new. The 3 columns you can see are new, but they are like the old columns. And then clearly this cut and the stair are new. And with this gesture in terms of the plan, you really make the building, which was previously private, much more public. Yeah. And I guess one of the reasons it was an enjoyable project was that the contractor and the subcontractors, yeah, they were really up for it. And so doing things which were not so easy to do. Okay. Sorry. This is a very, very small project that we did last year, and it's called Omara Mara Ola, and it was an exhibition in the main lecture hall in the part of ETH where I teach, which is in Erlikon. It's called the Focus Halle, and it was a collaboration with the 2 curators of the gallery at the ETH, who I've done a lot of projects with, and it's an exhibition of Mara Ola, who is Roma artist from Budapest who had died just a few years ago and whose work never was made for galleries. She actually would install her work in the city. But her work has now become quite valuable and it's represented by quite a good gallery. So this was really an experiment to see if we could make an exhibition in a space that already was quite heavily used. So a lecture hall, where on Thursday all day, the first year of the ETH, 350 students have their drawing lessons, for instance. And the biggest part of the project was really negotiating with my colleagues that we could do this, that we could make this exhibition in a way that didn't get in the way of the previous uses of the space. A week after the opening, I gave a lecture in the space as part of the school lecture series. So it's a different take on this idea of bound and unbound, but it's saying, how can art and an exhibition that's quite tightly curated exist simultaneously with other uses, you know? Because, does an exhibition always have to be in a gallery? So we managed to do negotiations. It was quite difficult. We built the exhibition in 4 days, and then it was up for a month. And there were 2 conference days during that month. And this was at the opening, before the opening. It's very simple, you can see, and the elements of the exhibition somehow are just an extension of the architecture of the room, which is quite beautiful. There's a mezzanine where there were other art other artists that are to do with the Roma scene. And then as it got darker outside, these tables, which were set up by another kind of collective group within the ETH, and there was catering done by a local Ethiopian restaurant, and there was a DJ who came from Hungary, who had a Roma background. This exhibition space became more of a kind of performance space and a party space. And it was kind of an amazing experience that it could be all of those things in the same place. Which is kind of, I guess for me, it's a kind of questioning, do you always need to build a building in order to do certain things in a space? Yeah. And then the last project in this section is Triple Folly, a project that we finished in 2022, which was a project for the Danish textile company Kvadrat, and it was a collaboration with the artist Thomas Demand, who we've done projects for the last 25 years with. And they asked Thomas to do a pavilion where they could have small conferences as an art project, and he wasted a lot of time, and at some point they really said, come on Thomas, you have to do it. So we had a few meetings, he made many sketches and sketch models, and then he came up with this idea of these 3 volumes, which are all based on paper, things to do with actually food. So one is a piece of legal paper, the one that goes like this, so that's just a piece of paper, but one is like a paper plate, and the other one is like a paper hat that a person at a diner would wear in New York. And he sent me in a box the model with this note, can you make this into architecture? And for me, this project really is a question about, because it's an art project where Thomas designed almost everything, but then we had to, Thomas Demand is an artist who makes things out of paper and then makes photographs of these full-scale paper models. But we couldn't make this in paper because it's outside and it's meant to last for a while. So it was incredibly interesting process. So this is it. It's in this dune landscape in the middle of Denmark, near Aarhus. So that's where the main office of Kvadrat is. And it's these 3 volumes within this dune landscape. And the colors, and this is the plan, so it's 3 rooms, and it's where important clients come, it's where their buyers go for annual conferences. It's like a party pavilion. And this is the first visit we made to the site, and there's this amazing ecology of wildflowers, and I think that's one of the things that Thomas had in his mind when thinking about some of the colors. So this is it when it was finished. And you could see, so that you can see the paper there, and the hat, and the paper plate. In the end, everything is made of fiberglass, which is not the most sustainable material, but you can do a lot with fiberglass. But it was made by a company that otherwise makes giant wind turbines, which is a real expertise in this part of Denmark. So we worked with these people who really knew their fiberglass. And then the paper, you can see it's very, very thin, so you see the light through it. And it has lines like the paper and the hole, so it can go into the binder. And that's Thomas in this rosemary trochel work, which hangs permanently in one of the rooms. So I guess this project I'm really asking, like in the Omara, the previous one, it was like, how much do you need to do to make a space for an exhibition, let's say? And then this project, it's really the question is it even architecture? I mean, you use it, it's a programmatic space, but it actually was largely designed by an artist. And my role was really to figure out how you could make it in a way that the construction details didn't completely obscure the formal and the kind of atmosphere that Thomas wanted the thing to have. And I think it was successful, luckily. Okay, my third point. So this is about gleaning. These are some gleaners. Yeah, this is a Millet painting of gleaning. I recently rewatched, and my students are actually using it as a reference this semester, Agnès Varda's film of 2000 called Les Glaneurs et la Glaneuse, which is all about different forms of gleaning. So Varda follows a cast of characters who practice different forms of gleaning within contemporary French society. On the countryside, she meets families who follow the commercial harvest and gather up material that's either missed by the agricultural machines or unwanted by the market, like potatoes that are too small or too ugly to sell. Their livelihood is not so different from the harvest that's depicted in Jean-François Millet's painting of the mid-19th century. And as the film explains, this secondary form of harvest is still protected in French law. So the law protects this secondary gathering of food. Varda depicts other forms of gleaning also, of people who inhabit the edges of society and scrape together an existence with impressive ingenuity. For instance, going to supermarkets or to markets and at the end of the day and collecting the food that's going to be thrown away because it's past its sell-by date, for instance. She also follows people whose collections from the detritus of late capitalism seems more of an ethical choice. The point of gleaning is that the material required for human existence is gathered from what is already available in the world. The film, with these 4 different examples of gleaning, underlines how much such material is available in our late capitalist economic system. The implications to gleaning in architecture are clear, that we can accomplish the majority of the architectural capacity that we require, at least in the West, within the structures and with materials that already exist. Architects will require new kinds of ingenuity, of material knowledge, of formal imagination, but like previous times when our discipline has undergone a paradigm shift, these new ways of thinking will renew architecture and reconnect it to its social and physical context and produce new formal invention. The most important shift in how architecture is thought about is that program must be in conversation with the project situation and not simply imposed on it. Today we went to the Slovakian radio headquarters, and which is really like a survivor from another time, and I think given other circumstances, or if it was in another place, that building would have been vacated by the radio station because people would have said it doesn't satisfy the technical requirements of a radio station. Because of a number of things being in a particular way, the radio station is still there, and as far as we heard, it still works perfectly well. They don't use the building as fully as they used to, but they use it. And that's not to say the building doesn't need to be renovated. It does. But I think if you wait long enough, humans are ingenious enough to be able to adapt to changing circumstances. They're able to make spaces continue to work effectively. So that's very different from the way in which we get projects today, or the situations in which we do competitions for projects. Often program or technical deficiencies are used as an excuse to justify demolition. Very, very often that's the case. So what I'm saying is that when we develop programs, we should really do it with a knowledge of where the program is going to be played out, and that the program in detail should be developed in relationship to the place where it's going to be done, the project. So it's a bit like sampling in music, that one achieves a synthesis through the process of working, rather than starting with an abstract concept and then working towards it. That the process of developing the program, but also the process of developing the project, could be something where it's only at the end one fully understands the synthesis that one requires for the project. Okay. So these are some projects where we've been lucky enough, well, some of them, to be involved in an early stage where the building was present, the overall idea for what should be in the building was present, but there was not a detailed program. So this is Newport Street, which is a street of industrial buildings in South London, which we converted into a museum for the artist Damien Hirst, for his collection. He has a collection of something like 4,000 objects, and he wanted to have a museum where he could show them to the public. So this is the building. The three middle buildings are existing. On this side, with the zigzag roof, was a very low shed which we replaced, and on the other side was a also not very well built warehouse which we replaced, which I think if we were doing this project today we would have kept that building. And this is the idea for the museum. So the building is a monument, and it was where they painted scenery in Victorian times for the theatre. So it was sheds that had no floors in them, only big volumes. So we had these big volumes, and we made this project where there would be a ground floor that's continuous and a first floor that's continuous, and that would be the museum. And the first floors are new because there were no floors in the building, and they're built with a very big loading capacity, so it works for contemporary art. So the number of galleries, the area of galleries, the way in which the sequence would work, all of those things were things that we developed with the client, knowing the kinds of shows he wanted to do, trying things, talking with him, and then developing the project. So this is the plan on the ground floor and on the upper floor. And then there were also kind of improvisations and developments that had to be done in terms of how you make the building. So the existing buildings were made with the absolute cheapest bricks. These were really cheap industrial buildings. They would go every week and see what bricks were available, and they would use them. So the existing buildings had 4 different kinds of bricks, which you can see in the photograph. When we made the new building next to it, we had to decide how do you make something which kind of is an extension of the existing, where we're not going to, those existing bricks don't exist anymore. So we developed a kind of also quite a modest brick, it wasn't that expensive, which had something of that variety. So the kind of attitude that I'm talking about is not just programmatic, it's also in terms of decisions to do with construction and technique. So there's a big jumbotron. This is when there was an amazing Jeff Koons show there. So that's the buildings. And then this series of spaces. And at a detailed level, there's this idea of kind of gleaning. So the shape of the galleries are the shape of the spaces that we found. And then there was a long discussion about how clean or rough the galleries should be. And actually our early versions of the project, the galleries were rougher, but Damien Hirst wasn't interested in that. He wanted the galleries to be more like commercial galleries. So there was a kind of balance between the finishes of the gallery, but he was very clear that the shape of the gallery, the inconsistency of where natural light comes in, that those things should be a consequence of what was already there. This is a gallery on the first floor where we reused these very spindly wooden trusses. It required an enormous amount of work to use them, but we did. And then the new gallery, which has its own shape and own idea of lighting. So it's the Jeff Koons show. And then in the back, there are these 4 new stairs, which are quite elaborate. They're still made with brick, with load-bearing brick, like the existing building. But in their elaboration, they're the thing which tells you that this quite modest industrial building has become a public building. And they also give you these different options about how to use the building. Okay, this is a kind of sad tale. So this is at Bern, and it's a competition that we did last year, and we only applied for the competition to prove that you could keep the existing building, which is the building in the middle, which is a building that was finished in 1985 by the architectural firm Atelier 5, who at the time were probably the best known Swiss architects in the world. They did Hallen 5, which is a very famous housing project, but they did all sorts of buildings, and it's a very good gallery building. And the competition was to demolish this building and replace it with a new building for extremely spurious reasons. So we applied, and we were then invited to participate. So it was a funny competition. There were 38 architects in the first stage, which was a very small submission. Of the 38 architects, we were the only ones to keep the existing building. The only ones. I couldn't believe it. Then we were shortlisted in the final 8. we won a prize, but I think they gave us a prize because in the jury report they just said all the reasons why our scheme was impossible, which was complete bullshit, because actually the winner has less gallery space. The galleries are less connected than the current situation and in our project. So really they had this idée fixe that they needed a new building. I'll just go very quickly through it. So that's the building on the street. The facade is not amazing, but clearly you could make a new facade. This is it to the Our River. So it's a very substantial building, which has had 40 years of exhibitions in it, and they're proposing to just completely remove it. So our scheme was to keep it, and there was in the competition this new building on the far side where you could use it for offices, but we used it for a gallery instead, and we could satisfy the whole program with much less construction and no demolition. I'm not going to go through it in detail because this is taking too long, but so this is the plan, and then the middle part, that's the existing building. And we made we also solved problems, like the existing building doesn't have an accessible entrance. You have to go upstairs. So with our project, we made this pavement space so that at the far end there would be an entrance which was at the same level as the pavement, and then you could either go into a new entrance or into the old entrance, and they were connected. There were so many things you could do without, and the winner, by demolishing the existing building and building a new gallery, it didn't solve any of these problems any better. It wasn't like that was the magic bullet. It was quite unbelievable. And this is the section through the original building, which is a beginning of the 20th century neoclassical building, and this is through the Atelier Fünf building. So it's not just above ground. There's 5 levels of basements, which they're also proposing to demolish. Yeah, so, and that's where the offices and the workshops and the storage are, all of which work, but they're saying, I don't think the project will necessarily happen. But we just couldn't believe the waste of this in 2023. So anyway, so this is our scheme. So we make this new gallery, which is a pavement gallery, which we say is before you have your ticket, and this connects the new entrance on the far side with the old entrance. And it would be like the Turbine Hall or something like that. It would be a kind of publicly accessible art space connected to the city. This is the view from the original entrance, which we would retain as the main entrance, and the way through and the way up. This is the upper level, so this part is existing, the middle part is existing, and we make a new gallery in the building, which is a building for the police, which is a higher monument than the Atelier 5 building, which is not a monument at all. Maybe it will become one. So this is a sequence of spaces. This is in the neoclassical building. This is the Atelier Fünf, the central space. There's no Caruso St John architecture in this, just obviously restoration. The link, which would have the cafe education spaces, the new entrance, which worked quite well, and then the new gallery in the existing police building. And then a new facade, which fits in front of the Atelier Fünf building. So, and the idea of the facade was that we would use stone which was collected from demolished buildings in the Bern area, which has a very special sandstone. Anyway, so we got a prize, and we'll see what happens. You know, I think there'll be a referendum, and I hope by the time that happens, people will say, how is it possible that you demolished this building? Okay, I'm taking a bit long. This is the last building in this theme. So this is a building we finished a couple of years ago in Eindhoven, and this is the building. It's a building on a big site for Philips Electronics, which was built in the 40s as a storage building, and it's a highly listed monument. And it was empty when we started to work on it was a competition, and it's part of a big redevelopment of the whole site. So this is when the Philips factory was there. It was a bit like Manhattan for producing electronics. And this is the site now, and it's fully completed the project. So they turned it again into an urban quarter, a little bit like the Lille project, keeping some buildings, replacing others, and our building is at the head of the main alley. And the client is a very interesting social developer, so they do property development, but not for profit. So they reinvest all of their profits. So again, they were very open about program. So there was an idea of program at the competition, and we won, but then it changed many times. Then 2008 happened, and the project stopped for 4 years. Then it started again. And it was a constant discussion with the client, with the city, with other things that were happening on the site. So it really was a project where you could use the building in the most efficient and effective way. So our project, the main part of the building is left, and it's used at the moment for car parking on the site, the bottom part, and the top part of the existing building is used for interim use, so studios and things. The ground floor is a food market, and then on the top, we demolished the structures that were at the existing building, and we built at the back housing, which I'll show you in a second, and in the front, office space and this tower. So really the idea of the addition is that you would, once it's built, it kind of feels like it was always there, although it's completely different than the existing building. But you'll see the brick and kind of its formal language goes with the existing building. And then at the top, 80 meters in the air, there's this courtyard of housing, which is quite surprising, and it's affordable housing. Because a lot of the site has affordable housing because of the client. So that's the plan. It's as good as the Sullivan plan. It's as dumb as it can be. Quite big columns because it was a storage building. And that's the building built. And really, there's no distinction between the existing and the new, and there's no distinction in terms of how the plan is organized either, which I'll show you. So there's many entrances. So this is the entrance to the food hall. This is an entrance, one of the entrances to the housing. So you go in, it's called the Fame-Kabau. That's why it says Eingang Fame. And then this is like a found space which becomes the residential entrance downstairs. And some of the colors were found, and then some of the colors we kind of extended the color palette looking at Dutch colors from the 30s and working with Keim, who have kind of historically correct paints from that time. But then obviously this is new, but with the colors that we found. This is at one of the car park levels. And the car park had all sorts of colors which were existing. Our photographer found this Volvo, which also has different colors. It's quite amazing. I had to ask him if it was his car, but it wasn't. And then you go up to the top of the building, and then this is the entrance to the courtyard at the top of the building with the housing, which is almost surreal. But from the outside, it feels like it's really part of the building. Okay, my last theme. Yeah, I'm sorry, this is a bit long. Interiors. So the interior has always been important to me because it can be about separation and specificity. It's the part of architecture that can be about itself, insulated from other things around it. The interior has a capacity to be powerful and atmospheric, irrespective of whether one is working within an existing or building a new. It's at this scale that material assemblies come more or less directly out of the imagination, underlying program in the most profound sense. Like it's at this scale that you make things that have specific atmosphere, let's say. This is Queen Louise's bedroom in the Schloss Charlottenburg in Potsdam, an interior by Carl Friedrich Schinkel, one of a series of interiors in a very small palace, which in itself is a renovation project. It was an existing building which he made very, very beautiful. Its use of drapery both refers to the history of classical culture, but it's also a form of material transfiguration. Yeah, it's like it's textile, but parts of it become plaster, for instance, and it's really telling you, like, 2,000-year history of classical formalism. It's really special. All of the rooms of the palace are different, and they all are working in different ways to produce atmospheres that say something about their intended uses and say something about what is domestic. Even though it's a palace, it does feel quite domestic because it's a small palace. This is a detail of the facade of the Guarantee Building, another building by Louis Sullivan from the end of the 19th century. It's Sullivan's most accomplished statement of how commercial architecture can be imbued with a life force. The seeds and leaves cast onto the ceramic plates vibrate on the surface of the building's street-facing facades, separate from and a counterpoint to the rational office space of the interior. He was very interested in transcendentalism, which you could say was the American version of socialism, maybe. And really by making the outside of this building so precious and so full of energy, I think he was making a plea that work should have dignity. I think he really was doing it for that reason. So it has a kind of programmatic content. The interior, or the very specific facade, can have qualities that exist apart from the other parts of the project. They're the opposite of kind of a modernist idea of the inside and the outside being the same thing, although that wasn't even always the case in modernism. They're also the opposite of the way Hart and Negri, in their very important book Empire, describe the Crystal Palace of 1851, the Crystal Palace of the Great Exhibition, an enormous structure that predicts the smooth and infinite spaces of capitalism. The idea of the interior holds the possibility of diversity, of the ongoing. It suggests within the heart of the project that everything is provisional and mutable, that working with the parts is as valid as working with the whole. Yeah, I think, it goes with all my other themes, but it's maybe the way in which you could achieve these themes. So I'm going to show 4 things. So this is a project we finished a couple of years ago in Zurich, in a very mixed part of Zurich, for a young family. And the building was built in the 40s for the grandparents of our client, who built it as a warehouse for a publishing house. So it's the 3rd generation of this family. They still are in the building, and they wanted to live on the top 2 floors and work on the bottom 2 floors. So it's a project where we did almost nothing to the main part of the building, which is what you see. It's the white building with the gray base. We restored the windows, we repaired the facades, but we didn't replace the windows, we repaired their double windows. And then on the top of the building, we added the largest permissible volume according to the legal plan, which was shockingly big. And so the top 2 floors, the top floor of the existing and the new floor, become the house, and then the bottom 2 floors are the workspaces. And I guess this is showing how our attitude to the existing is different to how we do the top floor, although there's some continuity, but that within this very small building you have a very diverse set of conditions to live and work in. The plan is amazing, because it's so that's the lower level. This is the second floor, so the first floor of the dwelling, where we just put some timber storage as a partition between the rooms, and this is the top floor, which is also very, very simple. So this is the ground floor, where one of the couple has his graphic design studio, which we almost did nothing to. We cleaned it up. This is the first floor of the house. So on the one side you have this new timber wall, so all the timber on the outside is painted in with this silver paint, which has aluminium in it, so it's metallic. And then the walls with the windows are just the existing building fixed up. And yeah, I'm not going to go into it, but we use this, there's this book, a Japanese color book, which is a collection of color combinations that was put together in the 20s by a painter in Japan, and it's a book that we use on almost all of our projects. So this is using a 4 color combination from that book for these colors, which happen on the interior of the furniture and in the interior of rooms. So then you go upstairs, where we had to extend the stair from the existing building in timber. The new structure is in timber. It took 1 week to put in with a mobile crane. It was so fast and very precise. And then this is the living room upstairs, which is a big room to live in and to cook and to hang out in. And there's this giant window looking south with the kitchen, and you see these colors which are kind of in the interior of the silver. Okay, then 2 examples of, I'm calling the theme interior, but very specific facades that aren't coming out of the structure of the building or out of a specific technique, but are actually responding to the location of the building. So this is Nottingham Contemporary, a Kunsthalle that we finished in 2010 in Nottingham, and it's in a part of Nottingham called the Lace Market. So it's where Nottingham really got its wealth by producing lace with machines in the 19th century. So we had this idea, even in the competition, that the facade would have a textile quality like the Louis Sullivan example that I showed you. And these are samples of the mechanically produced lace that was made in Nottingham, and it's version 007 that we chose in the end, which is this one. And then we spent 1.5 years developing how we could make this lace pattern into a texture in the precast concrete facades. It really was a long process, and it was just at the time when certain technologies which connected drawing to 3D milling became available. So it was just at the beginning of that, but we were able to use it. So from this, we did experiments about what scale it should be and made models. So this was about the appearance and then how you would make it. And it's really just like a kind of curtain that's hanging from the steel structure of the museum. And then these are the units being made by a local precaster, actually, and an in situ. And it's extraordinary. First of all, the density and the quality of contemporary precast concrete. Not that we use concrete so much anymore, but at the time. And that really, it was like lace. It was more successful than we thought it would be. And then another example, this is the Bremer Landesbank in the middle of the Domshof in Bremen in northern Germany, project that we finished in 2016. So it's within a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it replaces a building from the 1980s, which was a really bad building, although again, if we were working today, I think we would make more of an effort to keep the existing building. And we wanted to replace the existing building with a building that really connected to the North German Hanseatic brick tradition. For instance, the Kontorhäuser that you have in Hamburg, like the Chili House and Speicherhaus and places like that, buildings like that. So it's an incredibly elaborated facade, which is holding its own weight, facing the cathedral square. We were looking at things like this building in Hanover by Pölzig from the 1920s, building that still exists but has been empty for decades. And this is the building. And so this is a series of plan cuts from the bottom to the top. So you see how at each level the piers get narrower, the bays go from a single bay to a double bay. Everything gets lighter and lighter as it goes up, and all of these elements are sitting on the ground of the building. And the bricks were made by a local brick maker. There's 9 special bricks, and it was laid in a traditional way by local bricklayers. It's a place like in England where the technology of brick is still very alive, which is very different than here, let's say, or Vienna, or South Germany, let's say. And that's the facade. So it really is like a textile facade with enormous presence on the square. Okay, yeah, and this the entrance, and this is really an arch made in the traditional way. This is the last project. So it's an existing building in the mountains in the Graubünden, which our clients found. It was a restaurant for many, many years, but that went bankrupt, and so the building was empty for 3 or 4 years. And you can see that the bottom 2 floors is a Strichbau, it's log construction, but then the top floor was added in the 70s in a very cheap and easy way. And the interiors of the ground floor, because it was a restaurant, also were not original. So we made this project. It's a holiday home where really we kept as much as we could, but then we also we added things which, it's not obvious how they go with what's existing. Starting with the front porch, which has these shape like Pierrot the clown, which you'll see continues on the inside. So this is a section of the house. There's a cellar, and then the ground floor is kind of public spaces with new linings. The middle floor has bedrooms, and it's the log construction preserved. And then the top floor is this 1970s construction, which we painted this giant stripe pattern to somehow ameliorate the very cheap pine boards that were in the interior. And the only structural change to the building is in the back, this double height space, which was added in the 70s. We removed the floor in order to make the salon, because originally the mayor of the town said you could buy the house, but you need to have public uses in it. And then the second time they met him, he said, no, you don't have to have the public uses, but they already liked the idea. So they have a program of concerts and exhibitions in their house still today, like 5 years later. So these are some of the drawings we made, which are all about these different finishes and the way they come together. And you can see color is very important. It's actually not using the color book. We used other colors, but we were working with this second generation painting family called Fontana and Fontana, who are in Rapperswil, so on the way to the Graubünden. And it was amazing. And they set up a workshop in the house and did a lot of this specialist painting, which I'll show you. So this is the entrance with these chevrons, and then you go in, and the red floor is kind of the public part of the house. So this is the hallway, and these interiors the original was gone, so we added these timber linings, and the diamonds are made with a kind of mica-rich pigment, so sometimes the brown is the darker color, and then in other lights it reverses, and it sparkles because there's graphite in it. And this is the salon with the piano and the Murano. We have 3 Murano chandeliers and this red epoxy floor. So it's really a new interior, but the windows are the existing windows. And this is the stair, which is the old stair, but looking into one of the living rooms, which has this Wunderkammer between the 2 parts of the living room. Some of this lining is old, some of it is new, some of the floor is new, like in this photograph, but some of it is old. So it's really working between preservation, reconstruction, and completely new interiors. It's a new stove. And then the middle floor, which is the Strichbau. So you come up the stair, the new balustrade, which is just painted. And then the rooms are like this, with furniture that we designed. But then the Fontana, the painter, he found a piece of plaster on the wall. So this is a trompe-l'œil metal door that he painted. And then the chimney that goes through the house, which was also stucco, he painted. So this is trompe-l'œil. This was the painter's idea. Amazing. I don't think we paid extra even, just for the pleasure of doing it for him. And there's a bathroom, it doesn't matter. And then there's a new stair that goes up to the top floor, which is also bedrooms and a library. And here you see there are these cheap spruce boards, which we painted big stripes on, which have nothing to do with the boards, to kind of give a bigger, kind of more conceptual idea of these stripes. And here, this is the upper bathroom, where the ceiling and the door is also trempe d'oeil, and then some of the walls have tile also. And then the last room, and then the view from outside. I'm finished, finally. Thank you. If there's any questions, but maybe you're tired.
No, thank you very much. Perhaps we can have the lights on,
yeah.
if it's possible, not to fall asleep. Finally.
I'm not going to
Thank you so much. It was actually, I love the structure of the lecture. Really, it was wonderful. Thank you so much. So, dear audience, questions from your side. I hope there will be some, as usually. Many of them. Oh, is it already something in Slido? You have question? Okay, Andy, please.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I have a question about the Royal Belge, because you used, I think, the word camouflage several times, and also mentioned your interventions being invisible or gradually invisible, or the new columns kind of making them look as the old ones, etc., which is in a bit of contrast to maybe more traditional way of approaching renovation, which would be kind of keeping the original as it is and then adding a new distinguishable layer to it. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, why did you approach it in this kind of like a different way, if one can say that, if it was in the name of like the unity or coherence of the space, or what was that? Thank you.
Yeah, of course, that's an important question. And I guess we've worked on a lot of existing buildings and a lot of historic buildings like monuments. And you're right that the conventional way of working on a monument is that you articulate, or I would say over-articulate, the new and the old. And that's actually written in the legislation of conservation in most countries. And I think it's a modernist idea, actually. It's about rupture. So on other projects, actually, the idea of making it very ambiguous, what's new and old, is even stronger. Because we don't believe in this split, really. And I also think that after 5 years, your new intervention starts to be old. So why do you always have to have this dramatic rupture between because, like, if you think about a cathedral, for instance, cathedrals often were built in stages, and each time built in their own way. So you have like a Romanesque cathedral, which then started to be Gothic, and then maybe it even has a classical part. And so you can see the parts, but also sometimes they would go back to the Romanesque bit and do a bit of Romanesque there as well, because for them, I don't think it was about articulating the difference, it was about really having a different vision of culture. So in general, I like that ambiguity. I must say on Royal Belge, it wasn't such a big discussion, because I think the conservation, we were talking a lot with the conservation authorities, and they were pretty happy with what we were doing. We also used them in order to win some arguments with the client. But there wasn't such a sense, because I think with modern monuments, it's not so clear. Because a lot of people, when you look at Royal Belge, there's a lot of things that feel very contemporary. So it isn't so clear how you would make the articulation that's expected. So it's funny you asked the question about, you ask it because of what I showed, the range of projects, but we didn't do it so consciously there. It was more about, what we were more interested in Royal Belge was the idea of harvesting from the building. So we knew we had a lot of marble, which was quite special because it was quite thick, and it also had these details like where the air came through and things like that. And we really didn't want to throw that marble away. And so it was much more about being able to reuse things and really able to make a kind of internal elevation that, had an opening here and here, and just move the openings so that they were here. But in other respects, that it was like working on your computer and just, copy-pasting the elements. And then for the big cut, there are new elements, for sure, but, the way we did the paving, the way we did the balustrade, all of those things, we really tried to do it in the spirit of what was there. So it's absolutely right what you're saying. I don't have such a good answer because it actually wasn't something we were thinking about so much. We have projects in the office now to do with existing buildings where we're starting, where we are keeping more layers of what's already there, because I would say that's a big change in our work in the last 5 or 6 years, that with big existing buildings, we will clear less of what's there to start. We'll keep the stuff that 5 years ago I would have thought was accumulated crap. We don't remove things until they're in the way. And if you do that, you already have these different histories in the building. So in that case, we have some projects where the new intervention is actually quite different than the things that are there, because it's like another layer. So it's a kind of a shift in the way we're thinking about it. But I guess all the projects I showed, in the end what I'm saying is that each project is a different situation, and actually it's an intuition about what you do. And it's very difficult when you get a conservation authority who are very dogmatic, because then you really can get into wars. But in Bremen, we had a fantastic relationship with the head of conservation of the Lander, because everybody could understand how this building, which is new, was making a contribution that was missing, for the last 50 years when the previous building was there. So, and of course the people of Bremen think that the bank that we designed has always been there. Because that's the other thing, right? Is that for non-architects, they don't notice these differences between new and old. They just know what's there. And that's actually more important, actually. Because most people who use buildings are not architects. Yeah.
Okay, are there some more? You just need to raise hand, please, that I can see you if there are some other questions. But I would like to just add one comment that actually you start with it, explaining that what is planned and what is unplanned. And so that is perhaps a kind of a shift in understanding what is architecture. This is actually a kind of opera aperta, as Umberto Eco put it, that you are never finished with the work, and you can continue in a way, actually, what is most, let's say, inviting at that time when you are working with a piece. So, this will require also a kind of shift in the way how the people from the Monument Board are thinking about, and also a shift in a sense how architects actually think about their own works. Because as we visited those extraordinary pieces from 60s and from 70s, and this is also a question how to deal with them if we are somehow, if this is the finished work, or is it still open to be, let's say, reshaped in what way? So yeah, this is a very important question for nowadays,
it's
for architects.
Very complex, and the client is also very important in that discussion. That clients have to be more tolerant about the future of their buildings. Yes, like the radio station, that's, it would be incredibly challenging to work on that building. To restore it is the first thing, because clearly the technical installation needs to be replaced to make it work in a way, for instance, that maybe the windows open, or who knows what one does in terms of that. But then how does one treat the kind of 50 years of use that it's already had? and how much change can it take. But it's even a question in the terms of structure, for instance. Like, there's a big discussion in Switzerland that, not so big, but it's getting bigger. So in Switzerland, when you renovate a building, in most parts of Switzerland, you have to reinforce the structure for earthquakes, even though these buildings have been standing for 100 years and have never been affected by earthquakes. And it sometimes requires enormously violent work to the existing building. You need to put continuous concrete walls through the building. And we've had projects where we've had to do that. And now people are starting to say, well, do you really need to do that? You know, because if the building has the same uses it's always had, why do you suddenly need this safety? Because Switzerland is not a land of big earthquakes. It has seismic activity, but it doesn't have it's never had big earthquakes. So it's really interesting, and some structural engineers, you know, will already have a more tolerant attitude, but then it's about the authorities who are saying how they're going to interpret the code. So everything has to change in order to acknowledge a real will to reuse existing buildings. Many, many, many things have to change, but if they would change, we would be saving a lot of carbon in the built environment, but we'd also be able to do projects, smaller projects, cheaper projects. Like, there's many, many benefits. You know, if you would convert a housing building rather than replace it with a new building, the apartments in the building will be cheaper than in the new building because they'll be smaller, because apartments that were built everywhere in Europe in the 50s, 60s, 70s were smaller than the apartments that are being built today. So we have affordable housing projects in Zurich where, like, really for the lowest rents for cooperative housing things, but compared to the buildings they built in the 40s and 50s, it's still more expensive, the rent, because the flat is 20 to 30% bigger. So it's stupid, you know? And so you're eliminating the most affordable housing because all of the flats are too big. Yeah, and also, we all know that the kind of the household size also is generally it's less people, you know, so the area per person is even more exaggerated. So all of these things have to be discussed in order to really think about the amount of material we use, but also the amount of space that we occupy on the ground. And it's not complicated, any of it. That's the thing. It's not like solving a huge problem. It's just about law and the way economics plays a role in our built environment. Like, it's quite simple, actually. It's not unresolvable, but obviously, yeah, some things have to change.
Yeah, we have to have the social agreement on those things.
Yes,
this is the most important.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So, questions, we have some in Slido, so perhaps, oh, sorry, yes, please.
A student, it's good.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting lecture. I have a question regarding the competition where you attended, where you were approaching the transforming of the existing structure. So I wanted to ask how we can, as architects, communicate to society that it's very important to keep those existing structures, or how can we put pressure on politics that there are not decisions like this where they still demolish those buildings because we are aware of, or we have this knowledge. Mm-hmm. But I think there are still a lot of competitions where buildings will be demolished to make space for new buildings. So, how can we put, maybe with our knowledge, pressure on politics? What do you think?
I mean, the most effective way would be that somehow the discussion is happening at a political level. But in Switzerland, I can tell you that this shift, it's a generational shift, and it's a shift in time. So there were a number of competitions where it was open that you could keep or replace the building, or maybe the first thing that happened was that there were some young architects, because in Switzerland, in invited competitions, there's usually 2 young architects that are also invited. So there were some competitions where the young architects, or some practice, maybe we did sometimes also the same, you would keep the building and you would show how you could get the program, not exactly, but the overall program on the thing. And you probably lost, but it started a discussion. And then there was a couple of years where there were competitions where you could either replace or keep the building. And then there started to be more and more competitions where you would keep the building, because the city and certain clients have acknowledged that actually they don't need to replace the buildings. But there's still plenty of, it's called Ersatzneubau, where it's like, it's Neubau, it's not Ersatz. It's where you have an apartment building, you demolish it, and then you replace it with a new one. So I think architects can, it's like what we did in the Bern, we applied specifically to keep the building, so we made a polemical statement. We even got a prize in the competition. Like I think we got to the second stage and we got a prize because they knew if none of the prize winners kept the building, lots of people would have said, why couldn't you keep the building? So they gave us a prize, but then they said why our project was worse. But if you really look at it, it isn't worse, because if you know anything about museums, it isn't worse. So let's see if that discussion happens. But what I'm describing is not so strong. The stronger thing that has to happen is that the decisions are made on a legal level. So for instance, that, you know, when you have a one of the sites we went to today with the new buildings, so there was an industrial site and there was a lot of pollution. So they didn't build basements in that part of the site, they built up. Because when you remove very poisoned ground, it's very, very expensive to remove. Every country that I know of has the same laws. Like Lille, there was no basements because you had 100 years of industrial production, the ground was poisonous. So if you made, when you demolish a building, if you made it very expensive to dispose of the steel and the concrete and the glass and all the things you remove from the site, which you could easily do. It's already more expensive in Switzerland than it was, but it's not expensive enough. If you made it so expensive that it always was cheaper to renovate the building, that would make a huge difference. And that would be a very simple thing to change in the building regulations.
Well, it's a kind of revolution in legislation, I would say.
Well, but we have in the last 2 years in Switzerland, you have to do gray energy calculations. So you need to show how much gray energy is in the new construction, and it sometimes affects whether or not you're allowed to build a new building, for instance. And yes, of course you're right, but it would be very simple. That's what I'm saying. There's nothing complicated about that legislation. You could say per ton of construction waste cost it, because a lot of it goes into landfill. And, you know, every country that I know of has way too much landfill for the garbage and all of that stuff.
Yeah, but I think it's also about our architectural discussion. We spoke quite a lot today about ethics and about, you know, a kind of idealism that our profession lost in last year. So perhaps that's on you, on the new generation, that you should start to think differently about architecture, and perhaps this would be the revolution, that you are not anymore like completely in the hands of your clients, but you can just allow yourself to speak about the value of the existing building stock, and to, I don't know, to be more idealistic, if I can put it like that.
Yeah, I guess. I think in the end it's a legal issue though, you know, and I think it will happen, but yeah, when is the question.
Okay, let's go to the question which was sent to us.
This question continues in your idea of sustainability, and specifically this question deals with when you're working with one of your projects, especially one of these renovation projects, when do you decide what new materials to use, and how do you decide to use these materials in a sustainable way, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, and of course we learn more and more about that with each project. Lately when we make a new structure, if it's an addition, let's say, to an existing building, or if it's a new building, we try and make it with a timber structure. And in Switzerland, there's a lot of trees and there's a lot of technical capacity in terms of timber technology. And even in timber, not all timber construction is the same. So 4 or 5 years ago, it would have been CLT, which has a lot of glue in it. So now, really, if you're building with timber and you want to reduce the amount of carbon, I mean, the good thing about timber is trees absorb carbon through photosynthesis. And so when you build with timber, the timber has a lot of carbon in it for as long as the building is there. So you're trapping carbon from the atmosphere. But if you use a lot of glue, the glue is full of petroleum-based products. So now we're about to start a project in the middle of the city, and that's new for us and for our client. We use DLT, so that's timber which is not used this way, but it's used this way, and you have dowels connecting it, so there's no glue. So you're able to make plates that span 8 by 8 meters only with timber, very little glue. So that's good, and in Switzerland, the softwood forest is renewable, it's constantly managed. But of course we can't build as many new buildings as we build today in timber. That's not going to solve anything. So we need to build less buildings. So those are the really high-level strategic decisions. I mean, now we also try to use material from the site, or we try to use material from other demolition sites, and that market is starting to develop in Switzerland. It's in Belgium, it's quite developed, so you have online resources where you can buy steel, timber, stone, sanitary ware, all of this stuff which comes from buildings which were demolished or renovated. So that starts to become a marketplace, and we have to start to use it so that people make money in that marketplace. So that's another interesting thing, I think. So it's at many levels, But the biggest one is to build as little as possible, is to do as much as you can with what's there by moving things. If you can keep another really interesting thing is when you renovate a building from the 80s, the orthodoxy was, well, of course you change all of the windows. But in Switzerland, that's a nonsense. Those windows, if they haven't already failed, probably have 10 or 20 years of life still in them, and double glazing or triple glazing has so much carbon in it that you're much better off keeping the windows. So we learn new things on every project about where the carbon lies and what are the most effective things. Like the most effective thing you can do with a building is change the source of heat. So if you have a building that is using an oil or a gas boiler and you replace that with a heat pump, that's 60% of a possible 100% improvement you can make with that building. No insulation, no changing of windows, just where the heat comes from. If you have electricity that's zero carbon, which I don't know where your electricity comes from here. So that's of course, and in Switzerland it is. I mean, in Britain, I think 60% of electricity is no carbon. So we've had projects in Britain where we changed from gas boilers to heat pumps in the middle of the project because electricity has really has much less carbon in it. So, yeah. But you have to keep learning, there's people who are more expert than me, and so one has to listen to them, and then one has to convince one's client. Some clients are interested, some clients are totally uninterested. You can choose not to work for those clients. Yeah, it's lots and lots of decisions that you have to make. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dear audience, are there still some questions or not really? Are you satisfied with all the answers?
You can email the questions and we can gather up some questions for the future maybe.
Okay, but if there are no questions, we will not torture you anymore. So I would like to thank you once again, Adam, for coming. It was really it was a pleasure for us, and I mean, all the people, they enjoyed very much your presentation. Absolutely, I'm quite sure. So yeah, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, and of course, thank you for coming.